Creating a resin master mold for reproducing silicone molds. In this video, we're going to show the process of creating a resin master mold. Now, what a master mold is essentially a mold of a mold. And in this case, we'll be using polyurethane resin, some of our ArtKast resin, to mold a mold. Now, the point of this is for simple molds like this little decorative tile that we're molding here, it's really helpful to have multiple molds for when the mold eventually wears out. Or if you have a large production run where you need multiple molds to pour the maximum amount of parts, that's where a resin master mold like this really excels, because it allows you to pour up multiple molds and again be able to replace that mold exactly once it wears out. And if you're doing production casting, your molds will wear out. So what we'll be doing is we'll be taking a mold that we made in a previous tutorial, which I'll link to at the end of this video, and we're going to show how to mold that and then how to make subsequent copies with more silicone. And this is a great process to know if you're doing any kind of little decorative parts like these little resin bolts or nuts or anything like that, where you're doing lots of parts where, again, you know you're going to be wearing out a mold, or you need to make lots of molds for mass production. Now, to begin, we'll be using a one-sided mold. And again, this is a mold we made in a previous tutorial, which I'll link at the end, so be sure to check that out if you haven't already. And in that tutorial, we go over estimating volume and that sort of thing. So if you're new to this subject, that's a great tutorial to check out. But what we'll be doing is making a foam core box to go around this, because essentially we'll be molding a mold. So much like you've seen us do with other molding projects, we'll be making a foam core box. Instead of a pattern, we'll actually be making a mold box for the mold itself. Now, obviously, for larger projects like this, it's a good idea to use MDF or even plywood or melamine-coated plywood. But for smaller to medium-sized molds, foam core boxes work excellent. And they're easy to make and don't require any kind of specialized shop equipment. Now, I'm making this with a tolerance of about 3/8 of an inch to a 1/2 inch around the outside of my mold box. And I can keep this relatively thin because we're going to make this master mold out of hard plastic. So we don't have to worry about tear strength here. We're just going to be using one of our general purpose hard plastic casting resins. Now, I'm assuming most of you watching this have already seen of a lot of our other videos making mold boxes like this out of foam core boards, so I'm not going to go into all the details, but very simple process. We're just hot gluing this mold box down to another piece of foam core baseboard. And once that's all secured with hot glue, and real important with your hot glue gun, make sure everything is sealed up. All those edges are glued so you don't have any leaks. Now, this is the part where it starts deviating from a silicone mold process. We're going to be using some of the Pardal high temp wax. Now, Pardal high temp wax is just that. It's a wax release, but it is able to withstand higher temperatures. And we need that when we're working with casting resin that exotherms, because when that resin goes through that exotherm or that heat stage, that can sometimes push some release agents out of the way and still bond onto whatever is underneath. So using a combination of the high temp paste wax and a spray release is ideal for this kind of situation. And you especially want to follow these steps if you're making a plywood mold box or an MDF mold box, because this paste wax, in addition to giving you a good release barrier, will also seal porous surfaces like MDF or plywood. But real important to make sure you release the box with the paste wax. And before the paste wax dries, we're going to set that mold down in the middle of our mold box. And you'll find in that early stage, while the paste wax is still a little on the damp side, that's where it really holds almost like a suction cup. Our silicone mold will stick to that baseboard, and then we can leave that alone and let that wax completely dry and outgas. Now, just to be clear, that doesn't glue the mold to the baseboard, but it does hold it there kind of like a suction cup. And because the silicone is denser than the resin we'll be pouring over it, we don't have to secure that silicone mold other than that wax. And now we're going to spray this with the E236 spray release. And this is a great spray release for keeping polyurethane resin from sticking to surfaces like this, non-porous surfaces I might add. So a combination of both the Pardal high temp wax and that E236 spray release is what we need to prevent that resin from bonding to our mold box. Obviously it's not going to stick to our silicone mold, but if it sticks to the mold box, that of course will ruin the whole assembly and we'll lose our master mold. Now ready to mix and pour our ArtKast white resin. Now this is just a general purpose hard plastic that's ideal for this kind of process, making small decorative parts or architectural pieces, or in this case, master molds. So good, just general purpose, plain vanilla casting resin for a lot of different applications. Now, what I like to do when I'm making master molds like this is a lot of times I'll color code these so I know how they're being used and I know what the master mold is for. So in this case, I'm going to be adding a little bit of the Polypig Blue. And Polypig Blue is a blue polyurethane pigment. And the reason I'm adding that is so later on, instead of this just being a plain white resin mold, this will be blue. And a lot of times I'll also write on the side platinum silicone only or whatever. But the main point here is I like to color code this so I know this is for a specific product going into it, which in this case, this is specifically for platinum silicones. So that way I know just at a glance, I can see that master mold and I know exactly what's supposed to go into it. Now, ArtKast resin, this mixes 1-to-1 by weight or volume, and it gives you about a 3-minute working time. So we want to make sure we get this mixed up and poured over our pattern pretty quick. And then the demold time on this is about 20 minutes. Now, one little note there, I did pour it into the middle of the mold first. And one of the reasons I did that was so I don't have to worry about that silicone mold trying to float. Because if we poured around the outside of the mold first, that could actually cause the silicone to try to lift up off the baseboard. So I actually filled up the mold and then went around the outside. And small little detail, but an important detail to make sure your mold doesn't accidentally try to float or move around in the mold box. Now, when ArtKast cures, it turns white. So when we add that Polypig Blue pigment to it, obviously it's going to turn to a lighter shade of blue once that reaction takes place. And what we're looking for, those of you who have followed us for a while, you know the drill, is once everything has turned opaque with this resin, that's when it's time to demold. So when this goes through that full exotherm cycle, we're going to have one uniform blue color all over, and that's when we're ready to demold. And also you can check what's left over in your mixing bucket. And once you can pull that out, that's a good indicator of what's happening in your mold box, and that way we know our resin has completely cured. And again, real important to remember that polyurethane resin cures from the thickest point and radiates out. So check your thinnest cross section in your mixing bucket, and that's a good way to know when you're ready to demold your master mold. So here we have our finished master mold, ready to demold that silicone pattern and start using it. Now, once we peeled that out, overall, this is ready to go. The inside of the mold is ready for casting as it is. No special work needs to be done to that, but the outside might need a little bit of cleanup work since that foam core box, sometimes we might have some corners there that might be a little sharp. We're going to go back and trim those up. Now, ArtKast resin, once it's cured, initially probably about 10-15 minutes after it cures, it's still going to be in the somewhat green stage where it's easy to sand and trim. So that's a great time to take a razor knife or a wood rasp and clean up any sharp corners, because once that cures completely, it's going to be a very hard, about 75D resin, which could easily cut your hands if you have sharp edges. So make sure you trim those down, sand them if necessary, and now our master mold is ready for casting. Now, we're going to use this much the way we would just a resin part that we're molding with silicone. So we're going to spray this with the 301, the Zip 301 non-silicone mold release. Now, when you see that non-silicone, that doesn't mean you can't use it for silicone molds. Just the opposite. Non-silicone means it doesn't contain silicone oil, which makes it ideal for silicone mold making. And now we're going to pour up some more 5110, and this is what our original mold was made of, so we can put that on a scale, check it, divide that by 2, and we know exactly how much silicone to mix up. So let's say we wind up with a 300 gram mold, then we need 150 grams of A and 150 grams of B of our silicone, since this mixes 1 to 1. So once we've established that, you could take a Dremel tool or even just a magic marker and write on the side of the mold exactly what this takes to refill this master mold. And that way, in a production setting, you can have people just look at the mold, that master mold, and see exactly how much silicone that will take. So again, they just mix up 150 grams of A, 150 grams of B, pour it into that master mold, and you're good to go. Now, what's not shown here, I did vacuum degas this, but 5110 is a very low viscosity silicone. So some of you doing fairly simple resin casting may not even need to vacuum degas this particular silicone. The only time you absolutely have to vacuum degas is when you're going to be pressure casting later on. So again, 5110, just to refresh, 5110, the regular formula has about a 30-minute working time and a 4-hour demold. And we now have the fast formula that you might have seen in some of our recent videos, which is a 6 to 8-minute working time and a 1-hour demold at room temperature. So a lot of options there for you, especially if you're like me and you're impatient, you want to turn these molds around fast. The 5110F is a great way to do that. So here, we're just pouring more silicone into our master mold. And then once that's cured, we're ready to go back to it and demold it and do it again. So once we've done this, once we have our master mold in our shop, that's a great way to reproduce those molds on demand as you either wear those out or if you're gearing up for a bigger production run. That's a great way to reproduce these one-piece molds. Now, some of you are probably wondering about two-piece molds, that can this process be done with two-piece molds? And yes, it can. But here's the real important point. You must use a resin with low to no shrinkage. So for a two-piece mold, I would mold the two halves independent of each other with 1630 or TC 1630, and I'll link that in the video description. But that is a great way to reproduce two-piece molds. Now, obviously, those two-piece molds will need to be block molds that have a flat back to them. Otherwise, this process won't work for that. But that can be done with a two-piece block mold, molding the two halves with TC 1630, and that way you have the highest accuracy possible. And one final note as you get to watch this montage of me pulling little silicone molds out of our master mold, one final important thought on this is compatibility. Everything in this process needs to be compatible. And a lot of times we hear sad stories where somebody saw a video and they latched onto a specific part of it and they go grab product X to do in this process. And then they find out, once they've already bought product X and another product Y, they find out that these things don't work together, that the silicone they got on Amazon is inhibited by the resin they got from us or someone else or whatever. So make absolute sure going into this process that everything you're using is compatible. And I say that because the 1630 is one of those resins that is not compatible with all platinum silicones. So when in doubt, always run a small test to make sure everything is compatible before you do this, because it would be very sad to go through all these steps and make a beautiful master mold that's not compatible with the silicone you're going to be using in your production process. So again, can't stress enough, make absolute sure all of your materials are compatible for this process. Now, in closing, I didn't go over the volume estimations for this because, again, we covered that in the previous tutorial where we made that little mold. But if you're new to this process, it's always a good idea to, with your orders from us, request one of our current product guides, because in the back of the product guide, along with all the data sheets for the different silicones and resins that we sell, in the back of the product guide on page 45, there is a section on estimating volume. So very good information to have handy. So again, just make sure you request one of these. We'll throw it in free with your order. And as always, all of the materials we're using in our video are available on our website, so be sure to check all the links out in the video description. And of course, they're all available online on our web store at brickintheyard.com. And as is custom in the land of YouTube, if you haven't already, be sure to like and subscribe. And of course, click the little bell icon so you get notified when we produce new content. And thanks for watching.